Okay, so today we're going deep into this cost of living crisis that's been gripping the UK. And, you sent over some really eye-opening sources, and it seems like London is really bearing the brunt of it.
Yeah, definitely.
We're not just talking about, a few prices here and there going up. It's really about being able to afford the basics and have, a decent quality of life.
Right. And I think one thing that really makes this particular crisis unique is that it's affecting people who we've traditionally thought of as, financially stable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's impacting everyone differently. But just to give our listeners a sense of the scale of this, there was one stat that really jumped out at me. The inflation rate for food and non-alcoholic beverages in the UK was over 10% in 2023.
Yeah.
And wages just aren't keeping up with that.
No, they're not. And it's important, I think, to realize that you can't separate that from the rising cost of housing, especially in a global city like London. I mean, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in central London is now over £1,800 a month. And that doesn't even include bills or council tax.
Yeah, that's pretty mind-boggling. I mean, can you even imagine trying to, save up for a deposit on a flat with those kinds of costs?
It's a huge challenge, especially for people who are just starting out. And it's not even just the rent, right? We talked about those sky-high food prices, but energy bills are also going through the roof. So it's kind of this combination of all these rising costs, converging at the same time.
Right. And it makes me think of a term I've been seeing more and more, fuel poverty. What does that actually mean? And how big of a problem is it becoming in London?
So fuel poverty is basically a measure of how much of your income you have to spend on energy. And in the UK, if you're spending more than 10% of your income on energy bills, then you're considered to be fuel poor. And, with these energy price increases, it's becoming a really widespread issue, especially in cities where you're more likely to live in older homes that maybe aren't as energy efficient.
So it's like this double whammy, right? You're already dealing with higher living costs in general, and now your energy bills are taking up an even bigger chunk of your income. No wonder people are feeling the squeeze.
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, we have this issue of wage stagnation. So even if you have a job, your salary might not be going up at the same rate as the cost of, everything.
It's almost like running on a treadmill, right?
Yeah.
You're working just as hard, if not harder, but you're not really getting ahead. And this isn't affecting everyone equally, is it?
No, definitely not. There are certain groups who are really bearing the brunt of this more than others. Young professionals, those in their 20s and 30s, especially those who are trying to make it in London, are under immense pressure.
Right.
They're early in their careers, so they may not be earning as much. But then they're also hit with these crazy rents.
Yeah, I've heard stories of people living in, these really cramped house shares just to make ends meet, and they're having to put off major life milestones, like, buying a house or starting a family. Is that the reality for a lot of people?
Yeah, for a significant number of people, unfortunately, that is the reality. And then you've got low-income families, particularly those with children.
Right.
They're dealing with those same rising costs, but they often have less of a financial safety net to cushion the blow.
And of course, childcare costs are also a huge burden for families. It feels like every aspect of life is becoming more expensive.
You're absolutely right. And there's another demographic that often gets overlooked in these discussions, and that's the elderly.
Mm-hmm.
Many elderly folks are living on fixed incomes, pensions that haven't kept pace with inflation.
So as prices go up, their purchasing power goes down. And with the housing market as it is, downsizing isn't always an option for them either. It really highlights how this is a multi-generational crisis, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah. It really is. It's a pretty bleak picture, there's no doubt about it. But it's not entirely hopeless. There are, potential solutions out there, ideas that are being debated and could really make a difference.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping we could dig into next. What are some of the most promising strategies that are being considered to tackle this head on?
Well, let's start with the most obvious one, which is affordable housing.
Okay.
We really need to increase the amount of housing that's actually, affordable for people.
Right. That makes sense. But London's already so densely populated. I mean, where do you even begin to build more affordable housing?
That's the challenge. And it requires some really creative thinking. It's not just about, building massive new developments on the outskirts. We need to explore more innovative models like community land trusts, where the land is actually owned by the community itself, which keeps prices stable.
Okay.
We could also look at things like co-housing projects or even, converting existing buildings into affordable units.
So thinking outside the box. both in terms of location and design, basically.
Exactly. And of course, funding is a major hurdle, as always. But there are some interesting financing mechanisms out there that are being explored, like social impact bonds, where private investors fund a project and they only get repaid if the project actually achieves its social outcomes.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
So it kind of aligns everyone's interests.
Yeah, so there's a lot of potential there. But what about people who are struggling right now, who are kind of stuck in these really expensive rentals? Is there any sort of immediate relief that could be offered?
Well, rent controls are often brought up as a solution, and, they can be a useful tool, but you have to be really careful about how you implement them. If rent controls are too strict, they can actually discourage landlords from renting out their properties. So you end up with fewer properties available, which makes the problem worse.
So it's about striking a balance, right?
Yeah.
Between protecting renters and also making sure that landlords are still incentivized to provide housing. Sounds like a tough one.
It is. It is. And that kind of brings us to another big idea that's been gaining a lot of traction lately. Have you heard of universal basic income?
Yeah, I have. It's UBI, right?
That's right, UBI. And essentially, it's this idea of a regular payment from the government to every adult. It doesn't matter what your income is or if you're employed or not, everyone gets it.
Okay, so it's kind of like a financial safety net for everyone, guaranteed minimum income, regardless of your circumstances. It sounds almost too good to be true. I mean, what are the potential downsides?
Well, the biggest concerns are, as you can imagine, the cost and the potential impact on work motivation.
Right.
I mean, to fund something like this, you'd need some pretty major shifts in government spending and taxation.
Yeah.
And some people argue that if everyone's getting this guaranteed income, it might disincentivize people from working.
Yeah, so like, why bother working if you're getting paid anyway?
Exactly. But it's not that simple. There have been a number of pilot programs for UBI around the world, and the results have been kind of mixed. Some studies show that UBI can actually lead to increased entrepreneurship and community engagement because people feel more financially secure.
Interesting.
But other studies have shown mixed results on that work motivation piece, Some people do work less, but others actually work more. So it's complicated. There's no easy answer, but it's definitely something that warrants further exploration.
Okay, so it's not a silver bullet, but it's an idea worth considering. So moving on, another solution I've heard a lot about is raising the national living wage. Could that help to ease the pressure?
Yeah, it could definitely make a difference. A higher minimum wage would, help lift people out of poverty, especially those working in those low-wage sectors that are often the most affected by the rising cost of living.
Okay.
It could also, boost consumer spending, potentially give the economy a little bit of a boost.
Right. But wouldn't businesses just raise prices to compensate for the higher labor costs? Wouldn't that just lead to more inflation, and wouldn't it make things even worse?
Yeah, that's a common concern. And yeah, some price increases would likely happen, but I think the overall impact is likely to be more nuanced than that. A living wage could lead to increased productivity. You might see less employee turnover, which could actually benefit businesses in the long run.
Okay.
And, it could help to create a more equitable society,
Right.
Reduce that gap between the rich and the poor.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the broader social and economic impacts. Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the energy crisis. How can we address that, both in the short term and in the long term?
Well, in the short term, targeted energy subsidies for low-income households could really help. It's a way to give them some breathing room and help them manage their energy bills, especially during the winter months when energy consumption tends to be higher.
So kind of like a financial cushion to help them get through the toughest times.
Exactly. But in the long term, we can't just keep subsidizing fossil fuels, right?
Definitely not.
We need to transition to a more sustainable system.
Right.
Investing in renewable energy is crucial. It can create jobs, it can reduce energy costs in the long run, and of course it'll help us to combat climate change. But the transition needs to be managed very carefully so that it doesn't place an even heavier burden on those who are already struggling.
It's like this balancing act, again, right?
Yeah.
Trying to meet those immediate needs while also building a better future. Okay, what about transportation? In a city like London, getting around can be a major expense. Are there any solutions on the table there?
Yeah, making public transportation more accessible and affordable is really essential. That could involve expanding public transportation networks, offering fare subsidies for lower income commuters, and improving accessibility for those with disabilities.
So basically making it easier and cheaper for people to get to work, to
Yeah.
school, to access essential services. I mean, that can make a big difference in people's daily lives.
Absolutely. And it's not just about expanding existing systems, it's also about promoting more sustainable modes of transportation, like walking and cycling.
Yeah.
That could reduce reliance on cars, improve air quality, and have those added health benefits as well.
So it's a win-win-win. Better for people, better for the planet, better for the city. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. Affordable housing, UBI, living wages, energy, transportation. Is there anything else that stands out as a potential game changer in this, fight against the cost of living crisis?
Well, we tend to focus on the material aspects of this crisis, right? But I think we can't underestimate the toll it takes on people's mental health.
Right.
Imagine the constant worry of not being able to afford basic necessities.
Yeah.
The stress of falling behind on bills, the fear of losing your home.
Yeah, that's got to be incredibly overwhelming, especially for people who are already feeling vulnerable.
Exactly. So providing access to counseling, budgeting tools, mental health services, that could really equip people with the support they need to get through this. And financial literacy programs could really empower people to take control of their finances.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about giving people the tools and support they need.
Precisely. It's about creating that safety net so people don't fall too far, but also empowering them to regain control of their lives.
Okay, so we've discussed a whole range of potential solutions, but has the UK government actually taken any concrete steps to address this? And if so, how effective have those measures been?
Well, the government has implemented a number of measures, but how effective they've been is definitely up for debate.
Can you give us some specific examples of what they've done?
Yeah, so one of the big ones was the energy price guarantee, which put a cap on energy bills for households.
Okay.
And that did provide some relief, but energy prices are still way higher than they were just a few years ago, and that price cap is actually set to expire pretty soon.
Oh, so it's kind of a temporary fix, not a long-term solution.
Yeah, exactly. The government has also increased some benefits like universal credit, which is a financial support program for low-income individuals and families.
Okay, that sounds like it's moving in the right direction. What's the impact been like?
Well, it's helped to some extent, but unfortunately, the increase in those benefits hasn't really kept up with inflation, so the real value of that support has actually gone down.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of families are still really struggling to make ends meet.
So it seems like the government is trying to walk this tightrope between offering support and also managing public spending. And I imagine there are also a lot of political considerations at play here too.
Oh, for sure. Political ideology and priorities definitely influence the government's actions, and that can sometimes lead to, disagreements about the best approach. Some politicians are pushing for tax cuts to stimulate the economy, while others argue that the focus should be on increasing spending on social programs.
So finding solutions that are both effective and politically feasible, that's a tall order.
Yeah, it's not just about what works in theory, it's about what can actually be implemented in the real world.
Okay, so this is a really fascinating discussion, but I want to shift gears a little bit and explore something we haven't touched on yet, which is the environmental impact of this crisis. How are rising living costs affecting people's choices when it comes to the environment? And what are the potential long-term consequences of that?
Yeah, that's an important question, and one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. The reality is that when people are struggling to afford the basics, environmental concerns often take a backseat.
It's understandable, right? If you're worried about putting food on the table and keeping a roof over your head, worrying about the planet's future might seem like a luxury.
Exactly. And we see this playing out in a few ways. For example, as energy prices have gone up, some people have had to switch back to cheaper but more polluting forms of energy like coal.
Oh, wow. So it's like a step backward in terms of environmental progress.
Yeah, it is. And the rising cost of fuel has also made it harder for people to afford electric vehicles or to invest in things like energy-efficient home improvements.
So it's hindering that transition to a greener economy that we all know is so important.
Exactly. It's a bit of a catch-22. We have to address the cost of living crisis, but some of the solutions could have these unintended negative consequences for the environment.
So how do we solve that?
Well, the key is to find solutions that are both economically and environmentally sustainable.
Okay, so what would that look like?
Well, investing in renewable energy is a great example.
Right.
It creates jobs, reduces energy costs in the long run, and helps to mitigate climate change.
So a win-win-win, basically.
Exactly. Another example is promoting those sustainable transportation options we talked about earlier, like walking, cycling, and public transport. That can reduce our reliance on cars, improve air quality, and make our cities healthier.
So it sounds like a more holistic approach is needed, something that takes into account both the economic and the environmental challenges we face.
Absolutely. And it also requires, I think, a shift in mindset. We need to move away from this idea that economic growth and environmental protection are somehow mutually exclusive.
So it's not about choosing one over the other, it's about finding ways to achieve both.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that a healthy economy depends on a healthy planet.
Okay, so you've added another layer of complexity to this discussion. It's clear that the cost of living crisis has implications that go far beyond people's wallets. It affects the environment as well.
Yeah, and it really highlights how interconnected these issues are. We can't solve one problem in isolation. We have to find solutions that address the root causes and create a future that's more sustainable and equitable for everyone.
Yeah, that's a tall order.
It is, but it's one we can't afford to ignore.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the cost of living crisis from all these different angles, talked about potential solutions, and even touched on the environmental dimension of this challenge. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something we haven't really discussed yet, which is the role of technology in all of this. How can technology be used to address this crisis?
That's an interesting angle. Technology definitely has the potential to play a really important role, both in terms of, mitigating the negative impacts of the crisis, but also creating new opportunities for people to, improve their economic situation.
Okay, can you give us some concrete examples?
Yeah. I mean, think about the rise of the gig economy.
Okay.
Platforms like Uber and Deliveroo, they've created new income streams for people, especially for those who might be struggling to find more traditional employment. They offer flexibility and the ability for people to set their own hours.
So it's created new opportunities for people to earn money, which is great.
Exactly. And then there's the whole world of financial technology, or fintech, as it's often called. Think about apps that help people budget their money better, track their spending, or access microloans. Those tools can really empower people to manage their finances more effectively.
So it's like putting financial tools directly into the hands of the people who need them the most.
Exactly. And then there's the potential for technology to play a role in addressing the housing crisis as well.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, new technologies like 3D printing and modular construction, they could really change the way we build affordable housing. Make it faster, cheaper, and more sustainable.
So technology could be a key driver in boosting the supply of affordable housing.
It definitely has the potential. And we shouldn't forget about the potential of artificial intelligence. AI-powered platforms could be used to analyze economic data and identify the areas where government interventions would be most impactful.
So using technology to make solutions more targeted and efficient.
Exactly. AI could also be used to personalize financial advice, tailor education programs to people's specific needs and circumstances.
So it's about harnessing technology to create a more equitable and responsive system, basically.
Exactly. And while technology is not a cure-all, it can be a powerful tool in building a more resilient and inclusive society.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Okay, this has been a truly eye-opening conversation. We've really explored the cost of living crisis from all these different angles, from the economic to the environmental to the role of technology. We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked about all these challenges and potential solutions, but what's missing from this conversation? What perspectives haven't we considered?
That's a great question, and it's one I encourage everyone listening to really reflect on. Whose voices aren't being heard? What are the lived experiences of those who are most affected by this crisis?
Yeah, because data and analysis are important, but we can't forget about the human element of this story.
Exactly. We need to listen to the people who are on the front lines, understand their needs, and make sure that any solutions are designed with their well-being in mind.
Okay, well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive into the UK's cost of living crisis. I hope this has given everyone listening a deeper understanding of the challenges and the potential solutions. And I encourage you to continue exploring this topic, have conversations about it, and think about how we can create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Thinking back over everything we've discussed about this cost of living crisis and all the potential solutions, it seems like one of the key themes that keeps popping up is this idea of balance.
What do you mean by that?
We'll take the whole affordable housing issue, for example. We obviously need to find a way to help renters who are struggling, But we can't ignore the concerns of landlords either. Like we said earlier, rent controls sound good on paper, but if they're too strict, landlords might just pull their properties off the market altogether. And then we'd have even less housing available.
Right. So it's like you're saying, we need to find that balance where we can give renters some breathing room without discouraging people from providing rental housing in the first place.
Exactly. And we see this need for balance in a lot of the other areas we've talked about too, like the living wage debate. Yeah, we want to make sure people are earning a decent living, but we also have to consider the impact that would have on businesses and the possibility of price increases, which would kind of defeat the purpose, wouldn't it?
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot where we can create positive change without unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And this theme of balance even comes into play when we think about the environmental impact of this crisis. You know, we need to help people who are struggling to make ends meet right now, but we also can't forget about the long-term sustainability of our choices.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's like we're constantly juggling these competing priorities. How do we find solutions that work for everyone, both now and in the future?
I think it requires a real shift in perspective. You know, instead of thinking about these issues as zero-sum games where there has to be a winner and a loser, we need to start looking for win-win solutions that benefit everyone.
So moving away from that us versus them mentality and finding common ground.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, even if our individual perspectives and priorities might be different. It's about fostering empathy and understanding and really listening to each other's concerns. If we can do that, I think we can find solutions that create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Well, this has been such an insightful discussion. We've really explored the cost of living crisis from all angles. We've looked at the economic, the environmental, the social impact, and we've even touched on the potential role of technology.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface, really, but hopefully this conversation has given everyone listening a better understanding of just how complex this issue is.
Definitely. And speaking of giving people something to think about, I want to leave our listeners with a final question to ponder. We've talked about the big picture challenges and the potential solutions, but what about the role that each of us can play in all of this? You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, but even small actions can make a difference. Whether it's supporting local businesses, advocating for policy changes, or even just having these conversations with friends and family, we all have a role to play in creating a more resilient and equitable future.
I couldn't agree more. This isn't just a problem for governments or politicians to solve. It's a collective challenge that requires collective action. We all need to step up and do our part.
So true. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the UK's cost of living crisis. We hope you found this conversation informative and thought-provoking. Remember to keep exploring this topic, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep having these important conversations. Because the search for solutions starts with awareness and a willingness to act.